Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about solving one-step equations involving multiplication and division. So just to review, an equation is a mathematical statement indicating the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side. So remember, if something's an equation, you'll always see an equal sign in it. And one definition we didn't focus on yesterday, but we did talk about, a solution is a value that makes an equation true. So in this chapter right now, we're solving what's called linear equations. Linear equations are where x has no exponents, or it's to the first power. So you don't see the exponent, it's actually 1. But with linear equations, usually there's only one solution. Now you will see some exceptions a lot later in the chapter, but usually the equations only have one answer that makes the left-hand side equal to the right-hand side. So for this equation here, the solution would be x equals 5, or 5 would be the solution. Now how would you solve it? If you remember from yesterday, we would add 3 to both sides, and we get x equals 5. That's a really easy one, but I want to give you that definition of a solution. And just to cover this from yesterday, in some of your problems, you might have had a problem there was a negative x in it, even though it was you were solving one-step equations. Well, actually, if you have a negative x, believe it or not, they tried to trick you because it's actually a two-step equation. So I'll show you why. So what we do is we do want to isolate the x, or get it by itself. So we look and see what operations happening to x on that side. And on the left-hand side, we're subtracting 4, so we're actually going to add 4 to both sides, do the inverse operation. So we're actually left with a negative x over here, and we get, when we do the math, negative 2. Now what happens here is, and we'll learn about this today, there's actually a negative 1 being multiplied to x, and this will make a little more sense today. But anytime you have a negative x, you're actually going to divide both sides by negative 1. And that would give you an answer of positive 2 for this problem. So I think you had like 2 or 3 on the homework that were like this. So if you have a negative x, after you isolate that negative x, to get x totally by itself, we want a positive x. So we got to divide both sides by negative 1, and that'll change the sign of whatever you have in the numerator. Okay? But now let's talk about equations involving multiplication and division. So let's say we have negative 4x equals 20. And we want to solve for x. Okay, directions will always be solve for x or solve for the indicated variable. Okay? So always draw your line through the equal sign. We want to identify the variable and see what operation is happening to the variable on the side it's on. So here's the variable, and negative 4 is touching it. Well, if you remember in algebra, when things are touching, that is the operation of multiplication. So right now, on this left-hand side, right now, the negative 4 is being multiplied to x. So what we're going to do is the inverse operation, which is divide by negative 4. So the inverse operation for multiplication division, you'll either multiply or divide by the same number. So the negative 4's will cancel off over here because negative 4 divided by negative 4 is 1. So we're left with 1x, or just x. And then we just do our math over here. 20 divided by negative 4 is negative 5. Let's look at another one involving multiplication. So let's say we have negative 35 equals, we'll do a negative 7x. Okay? So we draw a line through the equal sign. The x is on the right-hand side of the equation this time. But that doesn't matter. It's being multiplied by negative 7. So we do the inverse operation and divide both sides by negative 7. These cancel out over here. We get an answer of x, or 1x. And then negative 35 divided by negative 7 is a positive 5. Okay? Now, just so you're aware, not every answer has to work out to be an integer in algebra or higher level math. So let's say we have one like this. And this is where it's so critical to show your work. Because some students will think, oh, this is too easy, I can do it in my head. And then they won't write it out, and they'll make a careless mistake. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say we have 20x equals 10. So a lot of students might look at that, and they might say, okay, well, I divide both sides by 20, so x is 2. And that's not correct. But we do divide both sides by 20, though. And the reason why is 20 is being multiplied to x, so the inverse operation is divide both sides by 20. So we get 1x on the left-hand side. Now, 20 does not go into 10 to be an integer. Now, it would go in about a half, that's actually your answer. So it doesn't, if your problem on the right-hand side, or whatever side I should say you're doing your math on, it could be the left-hand side, if it does not work out to be an integer, then leave your answer as a fraction in lowest terms. And 10 divided by 20 is actually 1/2 in lowest terms. Make sure you check your signs. That's your final answer. Okay, so in algebra, not every problem has to work out to be an integer. Just make sure you do the inverse operation of both sides, and as long as you're doing that, sometimes it might work out to be a fraction. Fractions are great, even though a lot of people don't like them because fractions are guaranteed to be exact answers, where sometimes decimals are need to be approximate. Now, 1/2, if we write that as a decimal, it's 0.5, so that would be an exact answer as well. But not every fraction translates to a terminating decimal. Some are repeating, some are irrational. So fractions are usually best if it doesn't divide to be an integer. So last one involving multiplication. Let's say we have negative 2p equals 48. We're solving for p here. I changed the variable. Well, on the left-hand side, p is being multiplied by negative 2, so we divide both sides by negative 2. So p equals, and 48 divided by negative 2. 48 divided by 2 is 24, so we got to make it a negative 24. Okay? Now what about equations involving division? Well, I'm glad you asked. So let's say we have x divided by 3 equals negative 7. So we draw a line through the equal sign. And we identify the variable. It's actually on the left-hand side. So we look and see what operation's happening to the variable. Well, the variable is being divided by 3. So what's the inverse of dividing by 3? It's actually multiplying by 3. So we multiply both sides by 3. I would definitely write that high. So multiplying by 3 and dividing by 3 to give you an answer of 1, or 1x again. So they cancel. And now we just do our math. Negative 7 times 3 is negative 21. Let me actually change this here. But we'll make it a little bit larger one. So let's say we have negative 28 equals y divided by negative 3. So the y is actually on the right-hand side of the equation. And right now it's being divided by negative 3. So we'll do the inverse operation of both sides and multiply both sides by negative 3. Okay, so they'll cancel over here. We're left with 1y. And we'll just multiply over here. We know a negative times a negative is positive. You might have to write that out real quick or use your calculator. But you do get 84, so it's going to be a positive 84. Okay? Remember, if we want to check this answer, we would plug the 84 back in here. And 84 divided by negative 3, that would in fact be 28. So it does check out. So if you ever want to check your problem, plug your solution back in for the variable in your original equation and just use order of operations to make sure the left equals the right. Now I'm going to give you one harder problem to end today, and we're going to come back to this type tomorrow. But let's say we have a fraction times a variable. Yikes. So 3/4 x equals negative 6. Well, if you remember, we did a whole section on multiplying and dividing fractions. So you guys know how to work with fractions. So we have a number, 3/4 times a variable, right? They're touching. So the inverse of, this is multiplication here, the inverse of multiplying by 3/4 x is dividing by 3/4. So one way to do this is to divide both sides by 3/4. So we're left with 1x on the left-hand side. But now we have to do our math on the right-hand side. So we're dividing negative 6 by 3/4. Well, we need to write out some work here. Remember, when you're dividing fractions, you flip your second fraction and make it a multiplication problem. Now this, in the numerator, the negative 6 can be written as negative 6 over 1. So negative 6 over 1 times 4 over 3. Right? That's how you divide two fractions. You flip the second fraction and you make it multiplication. So now before we multiply, we could also reduce diagonally, or you can multiply straight across and then simplify. So we could reduce diagonally if we wanted to. 3 goes into both of these. And 2 times 4 is, I'm going this way now. 2 times 4 is 8. 1 times 1 is 1. 8 divided by 1 is 8, but we got to check our sign. It's a negative divided by a positive, so that's going to be a negative 8. Okay? So I want to give you a problem with that with a fraction because that's a harder example. And we'll come back to those tomorrow, but you can solve problems involving a fraction times a variable. All you got to do is divide both sides by that fraction. So if you see fractions while you're doing your problems, do not be afraid of them. You know exactly what you're doing. Okay? Okay, so it's time to test yourself. And I even, instead of writing the word your, which I would love to do, I wrote it like the text message your, just to be hip like you guys. All right, I'm sure you, I don't know if you guys text that way or not. I'm just trying to be cool. I'd rather write the word your, but I'm just trying to be cool. So anyways, do these 2 problems. The next 20 seconds will be blank. So try them, do as best as you can, and we'll go over them. Okay, so hopefully you try these 2 problems on your own. If you did not finish them, pause the video and then restart the video once you're done. So for number 1, negative 4 is being multiplied to x, so we divide both sides by negative 4. So when we do that, we get 1x on the left-hand side, and negative 24 divided by negative 4 is a positive 6. Okay? Now number 2, the variable is actually on the right-hand side. And right now, x is being divided by negative 4. Don't worry about the left-hand side. Look to see where the variable is. So the opposite of dividing by negative 4 is timesing both sides by negative 4. So we multiply both sides by negative 4. So these negative 4s will cancel. We're left with 1x. And now on the left-hand side, I'm going to write this out. It's negative 4. Any integer can be written over 1, right? Times 1/4. And you guys know how to multiply fractions. You multiply straight across and then divide or simplify, or you can reduce diagonally. So 4 goes into both of those. So I multiply across now, right? 1 over 1, which is just 1. We got to check our signs. It's a negative times a positive, so our final answer is negative 1. So hopefully you found this video lesson helpful on solving equations involving multiplication and division. If you have any questions, please let us know. Have a fantastic day, everybody.